Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Sylvia Okonofoa, and I'm a Master of Public Health student here at Dalla Lana School of Public Health in the Black Health program. And I'll also be serving as the MC for today. Today, we're gathered for a conversation that feels not only timely, but deeply necessary. We're here to reflect, to listen, and to engage with questions of race, gender, history, and justice, and how they shape the world that we live in today. We're honored to be joined by a speaker whose work has challenged dominant narratives and offered a visionary, clear-eyed framework for confronting how patriarchy, both systemic and interpersonal, continues to shape our histories and our present. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Anna Malaika Tubbs. All right. Dr. Tubbs is a two-time New York Times bestselling author and a multidisciplinary expert on current and historical understandings of race, gender, and equity. With a PhD in sociology and a master's in multidisciplinary gender studies from the University of Cambridge, in addition to a bachelor's in medical anthropology from Stanford University, Anna translates her academic knowledge into stories that are clear and engaging. Her articles have been published by Time Magazine, New York Magazine, CNN, Motherly, The Huffington Post, Fort Harriet, The Guardian, Darling Magazine, and Blavity. That's a lot. This commitment to reshaping how we understand history and power comes through powerfully in her books, where rigorous research meets storytelling that is clear, compelling, and timely. Her latest book, Erased, continues the work she began in her debut book, The Three Mothers, which re-examined American history through the lives of Black women. In Erased, Dr. Tubbs turns her attention to the structures of American patriarchy. She traces how gender and whiteness have worked together to shape legal, political, and social life in the United States, often by excluding or erasing those who do not conform to a narrow ideal of humanity. And drawing on academic research, personal experience, and the lives of freedom fighters across generations, Dr. Tubbs reveals how the United States has systemically denied the contributions of women, especially Black women. She examines how this history extends from the founding fathers to the current Supreme Court, from the exclusion of women in the Constitution to the ongoing maternal health crisis in the US. And at the heart of this book is a call to recover what has been lost. Dr. Tubbs shows that the knowledge and resources to challenging these systems, intuition, courage, and ancestral insight are still with us. Erased reframes the story of the United States by placing those who have been silenced at the center. It opens space for urgent conversations about gender, race, and justice today. We're so thrilled to welcome Dr. Anna Malaika Tubbs here to speak with us today about this issue that I think is, urgent and timely. So please join me in giving a warm welcome, a warm Toronto welcome, because it's her first time here, to Dr. Anna Malaika Tubbs. Amazing. Thank you. I'm also pleased to introduce our moderator, Dr. Dalla Osman. Dr. Osman is an assistant professor here at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. She earned her PhD in politics and international studies from the University of Cambridge as a Gates Cambridge Scholar, and holds a master's degree in women's studies from Oxford University, where she was a Clarendon Scholar. So please join me in welcoming and giving her a warm round of applause as she leads us into today's conversation. Over to you, Dr. Osman.
Thank you. Is this working? Yeah? Okay. All right. Thank you for that. Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you, Anna, for being here, and congratulations on being a back-to-back New York Times bestselling author.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we're so excited to have you today. And I want to begin with a question that I think helps frame the stakes for us all, right? Whether we come to this conversation as scholars, students, healthcare workers, or community members, right? So you write that experiences of motherhood in the United States are controlled by American patriarchy at almost every turn, right? And that phrase keeps coming up in the book, right? And that this control begins even before conception And then you go further to say that our reproduction is controlled precisely because it's a powerful reminder of what we're capable of, a metamorphosis of ourselves, our communities, and our nation, right? So can you talk more about that idea, that ability to create, to transform, is exactly what American patriarchy fears and seeks to suppress. What does it mean to name reproductive power, not just as biological, but political and collective?
That's such a beautiful question, and I really just have to say thank you. Take a second to just acknowledge all of you here today. I'm so grateful. That was the best introduction that I've had thus far on the tour, so we're just going to copy-paste that. I loved it. Thank you so much, and especially you, Dr. Osmond, for having me. You are so wonderful and so talented, and it's an honor to be here with you. So thank you so much for having me. And this question of how does American patriarchy impact mothering and maternal health at every turn, I first have to take a little bit of a step back into why I wanted to focus specifically on American patriarchy, because I've grown up all over the world. I lived very nomadically abroad because of my parents' work. I often say my mother's work, but my dad said he felt erased when I said that. So, okay, both my parents, I was just more interested in my mother's work. She advocated for women's health and children here, in the US, and then as well as all over the place. And everywhere that we lived, she talked about the importance of looking at how women were being treated, but also how mothers were being treated. And I say all of that because I acknowledge patriarchy exists around the world, and I'm not necessarily interested in deciding which patriarchy is better or worse than the other. They're all bad. But I think that we have to start focusing and being more intentional about each of the places where patriarchy shows up, because the system of patriarchy depends on who the creators of that patriarchy were, how they used their opinions and wrote it into law. And so I'm also really fascinated and would love to talk to some of you about some of the similarities and differences between the founders of the United States, as well as those founders that are from Canada. And so in the US, the way that our founding fathers decided who was going to be recognized in our nation was right after the revolution. They were very concerned that they were going to lose the thing that they had fought for in the United States, which was to have power in their nation. And so the revolutionary spirit with which they won was spreading across the country, and they wanted to make sure that they got people under control. And so they start to define who is going to be man in the United States. And by the Constitution, they tell us that men get to vote, men get to represent themselves in business decisions without anybody speaking for them, men get to own land, et cetera, et cetera. And women are completely ignored by the US Constitution. They aren't even mentioned or named. But in letters that the founding fathers write to their daughters, to their partners, to their sisters, as well as to each other about women, they define women as solely having value in their ability to reproduce the power of men through children. And so obviously in those two very limited and flawed definitions of what it means to be man or woman in the United States, you're setting up this horrible binary that obviously is leaving out a lot of people who are non-binary, but you're also leaving out people who are enslaved at the time. You're leaving out indigenous people. You're leaving out immigrants. And so we're seeing that system continue to play out to this day. And if we hadn't analyzed it that way before, then of course we continue to be surprised by how it shows up. And so when it comes to the maternal health crisis in the US, if you're telling women, but mostly white women, your only power is in the reproduction of manhood and our power and our legacy, then they need to control that as if it's not that important beyond what you can do for us. So it's an ability that they recognize, but only in service to them, rather than being an acknowledgement of the power of mothering or the power of stewarding young people's lives or the influence of motherhood. It becomes something that is just a tool used for them. Then if you're looking at all the groups that were not included in this definition of womanhood, if we look specifically at Black women who are enslaved, for example, their reproduction is controlled from the beginning in a different way. During times of slavery, it's no matter how this Black woman comes to have a child, which we know there are horrific ways in which enslaved women were forced to have children, those children were always going to carry the status of the mother. So that places Black women as an antithesis to white men from the very beginning. If men were the ones who were supposed to pass their legacy through their children, then by law they were showing us that Black women were the furthest cast away from that because it was their status that they were passing on to their children. And so you're going to have a different relationship with maternal health in the United States if you're a part of the legacy of those who, yes, were oppressed in a different way, saying this is all that you do for us is reproduce children. And any skills that you gain, white women, it's so that you can be a better mother or a better wife. But that's also going to be a different battle than those who were not recognized as at all as human beings, and instead that maternal relationship was policed, controlled, and then of course when slavery ends, it no longer becomes beneficial to have Black bodies, and so then it starts to be you won't have access to reproductive health care. So that's the beginning of it, and we'll get more into how we see it play out today.
Great, thank you. I think what's really interesting to me about the way that you frame the kind of conceptual lens of the book is around patriarchy and not race, right? So a lot of the time I found myself thinking about whiteness as property, right, and the reproduction of whiteness. So I'm curious about why you chose patriarchy and not anti-Blackness.
Yeah. I actually really think that this discussion around patriarchy has been missing in our recent reckoning with race. And you know, so many people have said in the last several years, we're finally having this reckoning with race that we've never had before. And others would argue we've always been having this discussion, maybe just some of you are starting to pay attention to it. But I am so inspired by incredible thinkers like Isabel Wilkerson and Ibram Kendi and Clint Smith and so many others who have made it clear and obvious that racism in the US is systematized, that it isn't just one-off moments that are happening randomly, but instead that it is the result of how the system was designed. But I think that we've been missing how first there's a distinction of who gets to be human in the US based off of this flawed binary of man, woman, and how, in order to further racism, you first start with this problematic binary. And so that example that I mentioned around Black women being cast away from womanhood by challenging their ability to either mother and just be with their children, by challenging their ability to be, you know, the group that's supposed to be protected, which is another part of the definition of womanhood that the founding fathers carried. But you also see it in this constant need to remove a gendered identity, specifically from Black people. So during horrific lynchings, Black men are castrated. Black women have their breasts are removed from their bodies. There's these horrible ways in which those who want to uphold the notion of white supremacy are telling everybody else to fight for their right to be gendered. That is a tool used to make sure we are dehumanizing Black people in the United States, and not only Black people, but the other groups that I mentioned. And so without understanding that first and foremost, our founding fathers wanted people to fit into these two groups, then we don't fully understand how white supremacy has persisted, and we don't fully understand why there's been such an attack on the Black family, why there's been such an attack on Black relationships, because those things confirm that there is actually more in similarity and in alignment. So there has to be this constant push away from a gender binary. And again, that gender binary is wrong. It's limited. It's flawed. But it is the way in which people have been told you will access humanity in the United States. And so there's many groups of people who don't realize that they're subconsciously protecting that social order, that they're subconsciously fighting to be included in that social order. And in the book, I talk about this being how respectability politics becomes what we all aspire to. I just need to fulfill my role in that gender binary better, and then perhaps I'll know what it is to be treated as a human being in the US. And so we actually also see that play out in recent voter data, where there were some really kind of strange trends that were happening, particularly around Latino men and how they started voting a little bit more for Trump. I should say still, they overwhelmingly voted for Vice President Kamala Harris, but a lot of people were concerned about this trend. What's going on? Why are these men starting to veer more towards President Donald Trump? And one of the things I argue is it's this setup where you've been shown there's two ways to be recognized in the United States. And if you're not getting access to resources, or you haven't, maybe achieved the things you want to achieve in life, it's not because the system is against you. It's because you are not fulfilling your role well enough. So man up, do better, control the women in your life. So that is kind of the message that you're going to start to see more and more, because it switches our attention from focusing on a system as it was originally designed, and more towards blaming each other and fighting again for this right to be a part of the binary.
Thank you for that. I think about also in the book where you talk about like revolutionary manhood, right? Which I think is, it's the work of bell hooks, but I think it's really important to think about how things could look different in that way, right? But it also makes me think about how Fred Moten has a quote where he says, "This shit is killing you too," however, much more softly, right? And that really, I think, encapsulates the way that you talk about white men and the lie that they've been told, right? And how useful that is for the project of American patriarchy. But I want us to go back for a second to that 1800s moment where we're talking about the kind of emergence of a medical system. And I'm hoping that you can read a little bit for us, and then we can talk from there. Yeah. So I think it's page 158.
158, okay, perfect.
Yeah.
158, you said?
I think so.
Oh, I think I'm on the wrong page. It might be because, do you have the advanced, is it the advanced
Yeah.
copy? Oh, okay, let me find
Do
it.
you want my copy?
The advanced copy is different. You're getting an insight to when you publish a book. But while you're finding it, I'll explain a little bit more around revolutionary manhood. So there are many groups of people who have recognized that American patriarchy is fabricated, and that it's really just a story that is made up and that became a system. And so bell hooks talks about how we have to be people who remember that, rather than fall in line with protecting this social order that doesn't serve any of us. And so she writes about a reminder, particularly to Black men, that this system was not designed for you. And you cannot turn on your sisters, you cannot turn on Black women in service of this system above your own humanity. So she talks about us reclaiming revolutionary manhood. And I should say that in the book, I'm not at all trying to vilify any one particular group of people at all. I actually think all of us have been hurt by this. And I want to turn our attention to the design of the system, and less our attention at, oh, white men are horrible. That's not true. Not all of them are. And I think we often have conversations where we make these generalized statements rather than thinking through how united we actually could do something about American patriarchy once and for all. And so it's a reminder of how hurtful it's been even to the beneficiaries of American patriarchy. And so I have a section that I'm not reading right now, but an entire section in the book that I speak about how white men have experienced a lot of pain as a result of being told that your options are either to dominate or be dominated. That is really limiting on both ends of that equation. And we're seeing that play out with high levels of depression, high levels of drug dependency. The other group that was left out by the founding fathers were poor white people. They weren't considering them either in this notion of power, control, and money. And so capitalism is another part of this domination binary. Okay, we are on the part. In this chapter, I'm talking about the three sort of fathers of different kinds of medicine who have made it so that we have this horrific maternal health crisis in the United States that affects all people, but especially disproportionately affects Black women. And so I also would be curious to see how that plays out here in Canada, and would love to talk more about that. But here are these different fathers. Inspired by Sims, Flexner, and D. Lee, the foundation of gynecology and obstetrics as we know it today was built by white men who were guided by the control they could exert over a process that did not previously include them. Midwifery started to be seen as unhygienic, unprofessional, and dangerous, despite the fact that midwives, especially those working with Black women, had and continue to have more success in keeping mothers alive. So in this chapter, I'm discussing one of the primary reasons we have this disproportion of just horrific circumstances around motherhood in the United States, where so many mothers are dying. And one of the most well-researched parts of this is that in other industrialized nations that don't have this issue, midwifery is just as used, if not more used, than obstetrics. And so there is a whole history of that where particular doctors decided that they needed to be involved in the birthing process. Joseph Dalla in particular spoke about how labor and delivery was this horrible thing that women and babies were being forced to endure. And so he thinks that he can basically do it better. And so he wants more women to come into hospitals so that at the time it was mostly male professionals could have a role that they're playing in birthing. When previously it was women, elders, who are kind of mentoring women through the process, who are teaching women about the power of their bodies. The language around mothering starts to completely change in the United States and also becomes something that people can make money off of. The more you do to a laboring person and a birthing person, the more money you can make off of them. And so C-sections, you can make a lot of money. Inductions, you can make a lot of money. Pitocin, all of the things, you can make a lot of money. A labor that is unmedicated is actually much more affordable. And so this is also part of the reason why these men in particular wanted more women in hospitals.
So then I would ask you, how do you see these historical power dynamics still shaping the way that we talk about legitimacy, safety, and expertise in maternal care today? But also, how have they influenced things like C-sections?
Yeah. A lot of women and other birthing people often speak about the fears that they feel when it comes to labor and delivery. A lot of my friends, for instance, who don't have children yet, and I should say for those who don't know, I have 3 children. I have a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 1-year-old. And I became very aware of these issues because of my first book, The Three Mothers. And so in The Three Mothers, I'm writing about the mothers of MLK Jr., Malcolm X, and James Baldwin. And so I had to do a deep dive into not only their lives, but also the context that they're finding themselves in, and theory around how we view motherhood in the United States, and why so many Black women are facing these deadly circumstances when they're just seeking care for themselves and for their children. And so much of it came back to not only the over-medicalization of birthing in the United States, but also the lack of recognition of the humanity of Black women in particular. So another one of these fathers is the father of gynecology. And interestingly, just a point, a tangent, when I was posting something about this and one of my friends said, why is there even a father of gynecology? And that is a good question. Why is there a father of gynecology? Why is there a father of obstetrics? That is, just that alone makes you want to learn a little bit more about it. But the father of gynecology, his name was J. Marion Sims. And the way he became so well-versed on women's bodies was that he experimented on women who were enslaved. And when girls, some of them were 12 years old, and he would cut into their bodies without anesthesia while other people watched. And this is the history, the basis of gynecology in the United States. Joseph D. Lee, the one I was talking about earlier, is the one who has the title the father of obstetrics. He's the one that felt labor and delivery was this evil thing. He talks about it that way, and that midwives were perpetuating the evil of labor and delivery. So he's the other one. And if you've never addressed that history, and instead that history has been erased, so we don't have access to understanding how we've arrived where we are today, you do feel either unaware of what's happening or completely surprised by it. And then you have a lot of women saying, I'm so afraid to go into labor and delivery. I need somebody else to tell me what I'm supposed to do. And so then they're being told to deny their own feelings, their own intuition, and to constantly seek somebody else to tell them about what they're feeling in their bodies. And so you then have a place where there's women who don't trust their own bodies, but then they're also asking questions of people who don't necessarily see them as fully human if they're Black women. And that's why we have examples of people like Beyonce, Serena Williams, no matter how famous you are, no matter how educated you might be, who say, I'm experiencing something, and nobody's helping them, nobody's listening, nobody wants to do anything for them, because there's this constant denial of women knowing what's happening to them on both ends. And so it's just set up this really horrible circumstance. But there's also solutions that we know exist. We know that if we had more midwives, more women would be saved. That's been heavily researched, but we still are not providing access to midwifery. It's now become something that only is afforded to those who have the money for it. I had doulas with me with my firstborn, so I was able to go into my hospital with them advocating for me. With the knowledge that I had from the three mothers, knowing that I needed that. I had a midwife for my second and for my third babies, and so I had wonderful labors. And to be able to experience that and see that so many people are not being given access to that because we want to keep making money off of them, we want people to keep feeling reliant on others as experts over their own bodies, is really horrific and something that we need to pay much more attention to.
Thank you. So I want you to say a little bit more about the Black maternal health crisis, right, in general, for those who might not know what exactly we're up against, right?
And I don't know the numbers here, so again, I'm relying on you all to tell me, but in the United States, Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die in childbirth or pregnancy-related complications or postpartum complications than white women in the United States. And we have to definitely focus on that disproportion. But also, I often feel like when those of us who advocate for maternal health, are talking about that number, it allows a lot of people to sort of, because they're numb to the pain of Black people, and that's just a reality, it's really horrific, but it's also a reality. they also don't realize women generally in the United States are dying more than in other industrialized countries because of these complications. And it's further exacerbated for Black women. And I think that they don't realize that until they or a family member becomes a victim to that. And so I also want to find this balance when I talk about it, where it is a maternal health crisis in the United States that, of course, as we see with all crises, is further exacerbated. And also, something that we often, again, see in the United States is Black women speaking much more loudly about an issue, being those who are guiding our nation towards better results, constantly having to speak up, not only for ourselves, but for everybody else. This is a crisis that is impacting our entire nation.
Thank you. So I want to talk about the Supreme Court, right? Because you talk a lot about the Supreme Court, partly because you grew up in a family where your mother was a lawyer, right? And I believe your father as well.
He does too.
Right? So it definitely framed your way of thinking about these things. So you end part 2 of Erased with the aftermath of the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. While many experienced that moment as shocking, you write that for you it wasn't surprising at all, and that once we understand the historical and institutional foundations of the makeup of the country, but also the court itself, it shouldn't have been, right? So can you say more about that, right, and why it's really important for us to think about Roe v. Wade being overturned as part of a kind of pattern rather than an isolated event.
Yeah. I say in the book that we've never seen in the history of the United States an anti-patriarchal Supreme Court. That hasn't yet happened. It has not been accomplished. And especially this current Supreme Court, I spend a lot of time speaking about the makeup of this court because we continue in the US to be very surprised. I don't, but a lot of people are very surprised by their decisions. And so it's important that I break down who is on the Supreme Court so that we are less surprised by them, especially when 3 of them were appointed by President Donald Trump. 3. That's one of the largest kind of record-breaking numbers of a president who has appointed this many Supreme Court justices. And of course, the biggest loss of all was when Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away and he was able to appoint Amy Coney Barrett immediately. Which in the book I talk about how to be an American patriarch is not to be a white man. That's not all what I'm saying. There are a lot of people who are not white men who are upholding American patriarchy. There are a lot of people who are not, maybe were not even maybe born in the United States who are upholding American patriarchy, like Elon Musk, for example. And so when I go into these different Supreme Court justices, I'm explaining, for instance, Brett Kavanaugh, which we all, saw the stories about him. I'm explaining Samuel Alito, who was quoting all of Sir Matthew Hale, which was this British writer who believed that women should be hung as witches, like all kinds of things, and like this is the person that he feels most inspired by. And Amy Coney Barrett and her relationship with her church and how she was called like a handmaid, I think it's some title like that, it's in the book, as well as Neil Gorsuch and how his mother actually was, she used to be the head of the EPA. She was actually this kind of history-making woman, but she was very anti-women's rights herself. When she was first elected, she dismantled the Women's Commission in her state, and so also again showing she's a part of this system. And he thanks her as one of his primary inspirations for how he views policy in the United States. So if you don't know some of these stories behind who they are, you might continue to be surprised. But if you just do, of course, I talk about, oh my goodness, what is his name right now? Clarence Thomas, and the Anita Hill hearings. But again, okay, so that's I'm already telling you about 4 of them. So we have to see some changes in the Supreme Court. That's one of the things that I'm arguing in the book. It is the most unchanged part of our legislation in the United States from the founding of the nation through to today. It's one of the most unchanged. So for instance, this archaic notion that they can be there for however long they want was supposed to be so that they would be unbiased and that they couldn't be swayed. But we're seeing that that's not keeping them from accepting bribes or keeping them from having an allegiance to a certain party or a certain leader. And so most of them have this allegiance to not only President Donald Trump, but to the Republican Party. And I talk in the book about how when I was a teenager, and I started at a boarding school, my parents decided that they were going to go abroad again, and so I went to a boarding school. And they told me that the famous person who had gone to this school was Chief Justice John Roberts. And they seemed interested in that. I didn't really understand it as a teenager. I thought, okay, whatever that means. But it took me later, several years later, to realize that even this role of the Chief Justice is really inequitable. He gets to decide what cases they're even going to hear. The fact that the Supreme Court of the United States gets to say, yeah, some of these we're just not gonna listen to them. And then he basically now, because of how conservative the court is overall, is kind of the final decision maker on a lot of these cases. And there have been times when Chief Justice John Roberts has surprised us. There were a couple times where, for instance, he ruled in favor of DACA, but for the most part, he almost guarantees that anything that comes their way is going to lean conservative, and is going to be what the Supreme Court was initially designed to be, which is the ultimate protector of the Constitution, the ultimate protector of that initial vision that I spoke about at the beginning.
Thank you. So I want to leave room for questions. I don't know how we're doing for time. Sylvia? Yeah? Okay, all right. I have one more question for you before I open it up. So what did your own experience of motherhood teach you about your own power? And how has it shaped the way that you think about care, trust, and what mothers, especially Black mothers, deserve in return? And then part of that question for me is also, what did writing this book teach you about yourself?
Can I read that part? That one? Okay. I'm going to just read it from the book. Let me find it. Okay. This is from chapter 11. It's titled, They Have Taken Our Abilities. I am a mother of 3 children, whom I birthed within 4 years of one another. I nursed my firstborn for 15 months, and by the time he weaned, my daughter was due 7 months later. She nursed for 20 months, and by the time she weaned, my firstborn was due just a few months after that. I have been pregnant or nursing or both, without any breaks, since January 2019. I tell you this just to emphasize my hyper-awareness of what one body can do, and to explain how motherhood made me even more aware of my capacity and power than I ever was before. The power of my physical body, in constant metamorphosis for more than half a decade, is surpassed only by the knowledge I have gained of my capacity to expand my heart and mind, to not only do everything I did before human beings fully depended on me, but also to keep these children alive and thriving. I view myself as an unstoppable force who deserves unending appreciation and respect for all that I do and give on a daily basis. This view is what allows me to be the best version of me that I can be. It allows my children to have a mother who is whole, who takes care of herself so she can take care of them, who gives herself grace so she can extend that same grace to them as well, who feels confident in her intuition and supports them in listening to theirs. I wish this was the norm in our nation, but these feelings stand in direct opposition to what American patriarchy wants women, especially mothers, to have about themselves.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have about 5 minutes for anyone who might have a question.
Hi, my name is Hannah. So I'm a MPH Black Health Practicum student. Oh my God. And it was lovely hearing you speak. I love that we got to hear a bit about the Black maternal health crisis in the United States, and specifically concerning Canada. We don't even have enough racially stratified data to even make an precise assessment, but it is bad. I heard a bit about Adriana Smith and the case of her baby being born yesterday, despite her being brain dead since February. And I wanted to know a bit about your stance on this case and the precedent it has set as both the United States and the West at large seeps further into fascism, biofascism, and how it specifically pertains to Black mothers.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for just honoring her life in that question. For those who don't know the story of Adriana Smith, this was a mother who was pregnant and was announced brain dead. And instead of doctors allowing her to rest in peace, because she was 8 weeks pregnant, I believe, they kept her alive, basically so that she could incubate this baby because of abortion laws that kept it from being legal to allow her to pass away, even though her family, her mother especially, was asking for her to be allowed to die. My opinions on this: it's an incredibly sad, horrific example of what happens when our policymakers first have no idea how women's bodies work, first and foremost. But also, it's a clear example, and we're about to see it because the baby was delivered, I think 1 pound, 6 ounces, something like that, and she was finally allowed to be taken off life support and to pass away. And we will see now, especially those who fight so much for the right of fetuses, how much they might show up for this child who now does not have his mother, whose family is being charged for the costs of keeping her alive. And they already were not a family of means. And it's the question that, I'm not the first to say this by any means, but this notion of pro-lifers who do not care at all about the circumstances in which these babies will find themselves, but also, and in this case we don't get to know with the mother, but will they come around this child? Will they support this child? Are they gonna send money for this family to thrive and be okay? No. And so it always reminds us of just the need to just control women's bodies. It's not about anything else beyond that. It becomes undeniable, especially in this example, but we see it time and time again. This is not for life and for life to thrive, and we need to protect all human beings from the moment of conception. It's not about that. It's entirely about we as a nation, as a state, will decide what happens with a woman's body. Period.
Thank you. I think we have time for 2 more questions. Okay, there's one up there and then one up here.
Hi, my name is Yanai. Thank you so much for being here. And I was surprised at how relevant your talk was to me because I'm an obstetrician gynecologist in Toronto and a researcher. I did my master's here. One of the things that I've experienced as an obstetrician kind of just down the street at Sinai is that a lot of the patients who come to us ask me about an epidural. You know, an epidural is 80 to 90% of our patients get an epidural. And some patients come and say, I don't know how to feel about an epidural because I really want to have a natural birth. And people use that phrase natural. And so we say to them, look, my approach is generally to say, it's up to you, but ultimately, this is a modern approach that we have. And if somebody were to be having an appendectomy, we wouldn't say, you have an option. You could do it naturally, or you can do it under anesthesia. And so that's what I tell patients to be, and I've experienced it myself, that women who have an epidural that works and that functions for them, which is the majority of them, can have a really profoundly positive experience, whereas women can be very traumatized by the pain endured in labor, and I'm sure you can speak to that. So my question to you is, what do you think I should do? What is your advice to me as an obstetrician to balance trying to demedicalize labor, which I think is valuable, and trying to implement modern techniques that I think are maybe more ethical than traditional medicine, if that makes sense?
I love that question. Thank you so much. The biggest thing I'm advocating for is not for all women and birthing people to have the exact same experience that I did at all. If I did, that would be me reproducing the problem. What I want is for women and birthing people to feel at the end of their labor and delivery experience that they were heard, that they were well informed on their decisions, and that they knew the background to why either they feel something about their own bodies or they were told or offered something. And so long as those factors are met and that criteria is met, I am so in awe of how we deliver life. Whether it's a C-section, whether it's an induction, whether there was an epidural, whether it was a home birth, I celebrate all of those things. The only thing that I do not celebrate are people feeling and mothers feeling as if they didn't understand something that happened to them. And that is more the majority of the cases. You know, even when we talk about an epidural, a lot of people have been told, well, you just won't feel the pain. That's it, it's great. Versus having an understanding of even the data that shows us that postpartum recovery tends to be a little easier without an epidural because you knew where to push. You knew what your body needed. You felt it maybe a little bit differently. So for me, one of the reasons I wanted to have an unmedicated labor, and the way we give birth is natural, period. All of these are natural ways of giving birth. But I wanted an unmedicated experience because I read the data around postpartum recovery, maternal mental health for women, and I am somebody who just generally, I'm like a delayed gratification kind of person. If you tell me I have to work harder on this end for something to be easier on that end, that's all I need to know. So that was, for me, I thought, okay, great, oh good, now I know the numbers. I didn't realize. It's not just pain will be removed. There's actually some, even if it's minor, potential complications. And so I just think that there just needs to be more of an explanation around it. And even from that first feeling of like, I do not want to feel that pain, I'm so afraid of that pain. Then if you hear or read some of the stories of women who have birth without any medication, for me, for instance, it was this transcendent experience. I came out of that like, whoa, you all can tell me nothing. You see what I just did? That was incredible. I was on like Mount Everest. I wanted to like walk all over the place. Everyone was like, you need to like lay down. And I was like, me? Lay down? No. And the way in which that's translated into my mothering, I am so confident as a mother. I am joyful as a mother. There's a lot of research even between that experience of labor and delivery. However that experience goes will indicate how a lot of the rest of that relationship goes, because many women feel afraid. Many women feel somebody else has to tell me what to do, I don't know. And they go into their mothering with that. And that is really sad. And so in terms of advice, I mean, thank you, that's so kind of you to ask. I would just say, there's a lot of books that helped me feel this kind of empowered approach to birthing, and also an advocacy approach of, okay, if I have doulas with me, I feel more assured that they're going to explain some of these things to me so that if I do have to make a different decision, I will feel confident that I wasn't being persuaded to make that decision. And if we can recommend, honestly, not to toot my own horn, but if we recommend The Three Mothers or Erase, there's a lot around just women being aware of why they may feel certain things so that they can make an informed decision. We Live for the We is another book that I really loved, just around Black mothering and the relationship this author has with her children, revolutionary mothering, and birthing justice. So I know a lot of moms are gonna be like, I don't have time to read all these things, but just certain sections that are just like, be aware of the history that you're coming up against when you walk into that room. And the fastest way to be aware of that history is to have a doula with you or to have concurrent care. And so with my second and my third, I also saw my OBGYN while seeing my midwife, and my midwife was like, you really don't have to do that. But I find it just interesting to compare the different experiences. And I first had an OB who told me she wouldn't see me if I was working with a midwife. She directly told me, we cannot see you here. And I said, why? And she said, we don't want you seeking expertise somewhere else. So she basically says, and I will write about it at some point in the future. It's going in a book in the future. She basically was saying she wanted to have full control over my decisions. She didn't want me seeking expertise somewhere else. We need more obstetricians who say, I love that you want to have concurrent care. I want to learn from a midwife. I want to go witness what happens there. That's powerful. Because in the US, we have several examples of stories where Black women who lost their lives, their doctors were people of color. There's one in particular whose doctor was a Black female OBGYN. And she also wasn't listening to what her patient was telling her because she was educated in that system. So even she sees her own body and the bodies of other people around her with that veil over her eyes. And so I would say partner with midwives, partner with doulas, and try to have us return to a state where the patients that you're interacting with are not seeing you as the authority on their body, and instead are saying, let's work on this together. And it's even in the language. Like, doctors don't deliver babies. The birthing person did. We have to stop removing this notion that we have just gone into the hospital as like a vessel and everyone else is going to tell us what to do. Because if we live our lives that way and we mother that way, it doesn't do any service to us nor our children. So, but I love that question so much, and I think the doctors who are most willing to do their own learning, then your patients can have that experience of like, oh, wow, thank you for recommending that book to me. Thank you for giving me that context. I didn't even know, because most people just have no idea.
I love that question, and I love that answer. We have room for one more question up here. Can we get a mic up here, please? No, we do. We're at 2:10, so we have to get you out of here for like 2:30. So sorry, Jamal, can you pass the mic up here?
I'll keep my question really short. This has been just an amazing conversation. I've learned so much. And so my question for you is, as someone who works at a municipal public health agency, this entire crisis is so daunting, not just in the US, but here in Canada. So where do we start? Where do we go from here? What is your advice, leaving here today?
I think to kind of bring it back to what you said earlier around, if we don't have the data, sadly, a lot of people don't believe us. And so there's obviously so much history around women especially, but a lot of people who, when they say, I know this is an issue, I can feel this is an issue, I'm recognizing there's an issue, that people will say, no, that's not happening. You're just feeling that way. You're just imagining that. That's not happening. Until we have the record, until we have the data, until we have the numbers, it can be particularly challenging. And so I think one of the steps of advocacy is always those of us that can get the numbers behind the issues, while there's other people on the ground fighting and protesting and making sure that they're, meeting the needs of people on individual bases. Like, all of that is also really important. But if we're in positions where we can bring the numbers behind whatever it is that we're recognizing, it will have a lasting impact, because it's also something then that we can trace. It's also something then that gets an international lens on the issue, where other countries are saying, what is going on over there? Not to say that they necessarily will help us in any way, but even the talking about it will make a huge, huge difference. So I would say if there's any way we can fund research around this, or bringing a team of researchers here, or the focus groups that you can do, there are all the stories of all the birthing people happening right now. I mean, even in this room, anybody who's either birthed a child, or their partner has, or they've been there for their sibling being born, or their niece or nephew, in this room alone, you would have the data you needed to start. I'm sure, and I can see it just from the nodding, everybody saying, like, there's moments I can feel in this room of like, yeah, I saw something like that. It was me. And so those studies I just think are critical. And just a story that I'll tell about that really quickly. My husband used to be the mayor of Stockton, California, and there's a lot more I could say about that, and I talk about it in Erase. There's plenty of American patriarchy involved there, but and the erasure of me, but not in his election. He definitely earned that. But where I said to him, has there ever been a report done on the status of women here in Stockton, so that people can see how women are doing here in comparison to the rest of the region, the rest of the state, the rest of the nation? And he said, no, I don't think we've ever had a report on the status of women in Stockton. And so I said, that's what I would like to do. In my legacy as the first partner of this city, I want to produce the first report on the status of women in Stockton. And I want to make sure that at every turn when you're proposing policy, you're keeping that report in mind. And there were many findings that came out of this, but one in particular was that 30% of households in Stockton that had children under the age of 18 were led by single mothers in Stockton. And so if we could meet their needs, those mothers' needs in particular, you would obviously see this huge wave and ripple effect from focusing even particularly on just this one group of people. And so it's just a testament to the data. We need it, and we need partnerships. And we also need to hear people's stories and keep record of that.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Gosh, I feel like I'm walking away feeling super inspired. So thank you so much, Dr. Tubbs. And thank you, everyone, for leaning into the discomforts, leaning into curiosity and the questions. I see the MPH in Black.